Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current exhibition, Interwoven, The Many Voices of Fiber. This was curated by Tracy Rigger, and today we are thrilled to present the artist, Clare Murray Adams. As a brief reminder, everyone is tuning in today in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them during the Q&A portion of the hour. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks all, and welcome, Clare.
Thank you very much, Kat. And I want to thank the Ohio Arts Council for inviting me to present my work to you today. And I need to thank Tracy Rigger for the fantastic and fabulous show she has put together for people to see the many different ways people are working with fiber today. It's really exciting. Everybody should go see it. Okay. So I wanted to share with you all the different ways that I have been creating art. It started with making quilt making, but I have moved on into a lot of mixed media kind of work. And in order to share that with you, I have started by showing you on the screen is a quilt on the left that I made in the early 1990s. And on the right is a mixed media painting that I did recently in 2020. I'm sure you can see definitely a connection in my color palette and the way I use colors, and perhaps you can see some of the way I work with my compositions. This is where I live in rural Southington, Ohio. I moved here in 2005. And before that, I was in Canton, Ohio, where I taught first grade for 5 years after graduating from Kent State University in 1972. After teaching for the 5 years, I opened a small fabric shop, which had been a dream of mine for a long time. And that is what got me interested in working with fiber and doing quilts. This is my studio, which I'm very lucky to have. All of the quilts I'm going to show you were made in Canton, either in a basement or an attic. Those were the two spaces that I had available to me for working. I forgot what I was going to say. So I had a design wall like most quilters did. I would put the pieces up and sew them together. So this is all done in either the basement or the attic. And then I would do the quilting in the evenings in the main part of the house. So this is one of my first quilts. In 1987 or 88, I took a workshop from Beth and Jeff Gutchin at Haystack, Maine. And so up until that time, I had done a lot of sewing. I made a lot of clothes. I never made a traditional quilt, but I knew the basics of patchwork. And I was really excited to move into this area and learn something about quilting. So when I got to Haystack, Beth and Jeff Gutchin just kind of dumped a box of pre-cut triangles, rectangles, squares, and some strips of fabric and said, make something. So that was really kind of challenging and maybe a little bit daunting, but everybody had a good time. And there was a lot of, there was also some instruction that went along with that. But after the 2-week class, I went back home and started designing some of my own quilts. So this is my second quilt that I made. It's titled Symphony. And for me, all of the repetition of the triangles and the music notes and the shapes and that sort of piano keyboard border represents how I feel about listening to music. In 1981, there was an exhibit at the Canton Museum of Art called Ohio Quilts, A Living Tradition. And this piece was incorporated into that exhibit, which featured the work by both traditional and contemporary quilt makers. It wasn't long until I started designing things in a series. And so this was my first series of work. It's my dream series. And I was doing a lot of strip piecing, as many artists, quilt makers were doing at the time. And I was thinking about creating things in layers. So I used the darker pieces in the foreground and created those back sections with a technique I called cut throughs. And they kind of pushed the strip piece sections to the foreground. So this is Daydreams, and then for the lack of another title, More Daydreams. I also began to start hand dyeing my own fabrics. I really liked the gradations that I saw people were getting from hand dyed fabrics. So I made some hand dyed fabrics myself, and I would incorporate them with traditional or with commercial fabrics in order to create my works. Again, I'm still thinking about the idea of floating and creating a sense of space and layers. The piece on the right is called Box Kites in a Neon Sky. And I was really wanted those pieces that are at the top to kind of jump off of the quilt. I didn't want them to be contained. So this was the beginning of me making these shaped quilts so that I could do some of that kind of thing. Here are two more from that series. I had a lot of fun creating titles for this work. So on the left is Box Kites with Crayola Confetti, and then Kites Caught in a Sunset. Again, you can see the way that they're not square or rectangular. In 1986, I had an opportunity to do some traveling in Europe. So I went to Spain and Portugal, France and Italy, among some other countries. But I was really struck by the old town sections in those countries. I loved all of the courtyards and the alleys and especially the tile roofs. And so when I came home, I used all of my photographs and my drawings to start making a body of work that I called Travelogue. And so on the left is my rooftop quilt, and on the right is alley quilt. So it kind of surprised me at the beginning that there were TV antennas on the tops of these old buildings, but people live them, and of course they have televisions. So the rooftop quilt kind of has some looser pieces on it, as well as some more solid pieces, and those TV antennas. The alley quilts have, I use the zigzag section to kind of represent the way that the cobblestones or the bricks or the tiles were used in the streets. The piece on the left is called Aldstadt, and it's a hand-painted quilt, whole cloth quilt. And I used the same dyes that I was using to dye my fabric, only they were thickened, and so it was like working with paint. The piece on the left is Street and Sky. And so I wanted to make a piece that was just about what I was walking on and what I was seeing above me. The background incorporates the painting kinds of things using a resist technique, a really simple resist technique of putting a tape on to block out where I didn't want the paint to go. And then I did incorporate a Ohio star pattern into the quilt to represent myself. The pieces started to get bigger in this series. So this is Street and Sky. There is one other piece that's even bigger than this one. And it is my architecture that I had been working with, and some of the street and sky areas going through the background, along with some commercial fabrics and some traditional quilt blocks incorporated. I really liked the juxtaposition of my architecture with the commercial, the traditional quilt blocks. So in 1992, I wanted to renew my teaching certificate, which had lapsed. So in order to go back to teaching, I only had to take 4 classes, and I could take them in any area that I wanted. So of course I took all art classes. And then eventually I did stay on to complete a BFA. So on this piece is Dear Georgia. It's an homage to Georgia O'Keeffe, whose work I really enjoyed and was inspired by. And it's all done with silk screen. So I created some of my own silk screens, and then I also used silk screens that were available to me in the classroom. So I put a detail there so you could see a little better some of that work. And I also since I was going back to school, I also started machine quilting my work. All of the previous quilts I showed you were hand quilted. And then when you're on a deadline to get your work done for a class, I had to kind of force myself to learn to do some machine stitching. This is X Marks the Spot. It's again a whole cloth quilt. So it's one piece of muslin that was 16 by 20 inches. And I worked on this back and forth in layers. I would paint some layers, some colors down. I would save some of the colors by masking over them with tape or with paper. Then I would continue to paint some more. I might insert a little bit of what I call free form silk screening, where I would lay the silk screen down, but only screen across it in part, not all the way going across, so that it wouldn't totally fill up the piece with the screen. And it was a process of working back and forth between those two kinds of methods. This is another one that was completed in the same way. In both of these pieces, I started incorporating some more non-traditional fabrics, not things that you normally would use in a quilt. So this one shows some commercial fabric that was probably from the bridal department, some satins, and along with some sheer fabrics. And I left all of the edges raw, which was another step in a different direction for me. And when I looked at these two quilts, when I was considering what to put into this conversation, was they reminded me so much of the way that I work now with my collage work and with my mixed media paintings. So they definitely became an influence in my future work. As I was putting the artist talk together, things started to get more complicated. I was using lots of different kinds of materials. I'm really very much a process person. I'm finding objects that I want to start to include in my work. And so I thought the best way to show you how I work is to show you several different themes or concepts or materials that I continue to use all the time. So from 1996 up until present, I'm still using a lot of clothing, and often I use the clothing as a metaphor. So this is Soul Doll, and it's a vintage quilt along with a dress that I found in some of my mother's things. And so I wanted to make a piece that was about 3 generations of women who did sewing. So in the detail, you can see in the top left of the detail is a transfer, which was another new process of something that I have used for a long time to represent myself. Across from that particular transfer is another one of a little girl, and that's my mom when she was a child. And then in the bodice of the dress is a picture of my grandmother and my mom together. So it's the 3 generations of women who did a lot of sewing. This piece is also the first use of wax for me. I put wax on the skirt area to stiffen it and make it stand out, but also because I feel that wax reminds me of something that you use to preserve. My mom used to pour some paraffin on the top of her jams to keep them preserved. And so that also then referenced the idea of memory. This quilt traveled with me to Ukraine in shortly after 96. And when I went to a conference that consisted of artists from Europe, a number of countries in Europe, Canada, and the United States, where we talked about our own art practices and the art practices that went on in our communities. On the left is a collagraph printing plate. So that was something I learned in a printing class that I took. And I sewed this dress onto a piece of paper. So it's a paper piece. It's not the dress, but it's a drawing of the dress. And it's adhered to a binder's board, which is a heavy board that bookmakers often use. I sealed it, and then I could ink that up the way that you ink up a metal plate and then print it. So on the right is one of the prints, and I had added a dress pattern piece to the print as well. Please notice that little rectangle that's on the plate. It sort of looks like a picture frame, because then I use that in this next piece in a way differently. So I made copies of, or I did prints on fabric this time and not just on paper to create this quilt. So there's 9 dresses. They're printed primarily in neutral colors like a sepia color and black and a brown color. But there was a lot of white open areas. I'm starting to use some shears as overlays, yet you can still see through them. Using a lot of zippers in my work and have continued to do that. I think of the zipper as part of my visual vocabulary. And then if you look at the detail, where that little rectangle with the oval in it, I wanted to kind of individualize these dresses that were all the same to give everybody kind of a little personality or a little something different. So in that area, I would insert a photograph or an object like a key. Some of them have pieces of botanicals in them, and some of them just have interesting stitch marks in there. So I was trying to individualize that work a little bit. In 2005, I was on sabbatical from teaching at Malone University, and I had a residency at the Gentile Foundation in Wyoming for the month of April. And this is when I was able to really concentrate on my encaustic skills. I had started using encaustic about a year or 2 previous to that, and I felt really fortunate to get this residency so that I could concentrate on it. So these pieces were painted on, I painted this dress on my printmaking paper. So I painted that tan kind of background and the brown areas and the white dress. Then I had to make them in sections because of the length of my paper and also because of the width of my encaustic medium vat. It was only 16 inches wide, and I needed to insert the paper, pull it out, and let the excess wax drip off of it. And then once it was cool, I did my favorite part of this process, which was to incise those black drawing lines into the paper. So I would use a needle and draw into the very thin layer of wax that was on these pieces. And then I would use a pigment stick to run over top of the wax or over top of the drawings, and then wipe the excess away to get these drawing areas. So for my metaphors in this particular area, in the insecurity one with the gloves on it reminded me of how a mom used to put a string with the gloves on either end and then thread it through a kid's clothes jacket so that they wouldn't lose their mittens, which is kind of a insecurity kind of idea. The measure up piece has a balance on it and a piece of a ruler or a measuring tape, and it references to, for me, the way that people measure each other, measure themselves against each other or against society. And an iron, of course, you need a certain amount of pressure in order to get the wrinkles out. And so I thought that was an apt idea for pressure. The handkerchief diary incorporates several different processes. There's the, I used the collagraph print of a handkerchief. So I made a new print plate. And then there's also transfer processes in this, as well as the use of watercolor and acrylic paint. So here's some of the dresses that child's dresses that I'm working with. I transferred them into the middle of the open area around the inside of the handkerchief, and then added the watercolor and the acrylic paint. The one on the left is entitled Good Girl, Bad Girl, and the one on the right is Childhood Fears. And I had to put in that sock monkey doll, which I was terrified of as a kid, but all of my friends had them and loved them. I also worked with, excuse me, a lot of vintage clothing, and I wanted to talk about some issues that were of concern to me. So the truth about sticks and stones is about that saying that says, sticks and stones can hurt your bones, but words will never harm you. And I don't think that that's true. I think words can be just as harmful as someone's throwing a stick or a stone at you. So I created holes in the dress and mended the holes. And it's really not a dress, it's more like a slip. So for me, it seems like something that you would carry around inside you. You would carry this hurt around inside you. And underneath the frame, or underneath the dress, is a piece of a shelf with sticks, stones, and bones on it. And so for me, it was primarily about the idea of bullying. Still fertile, with a question mark, is from conversations that I had with friends of mine who were wondering if they still had time to conceive. They had put their careers first and maybe were thinking that their biological clock was running out. So I rusted this particular dress with some pieces of wire, and then I did a little embroidery around the wire. And so the rusting part represents aging, and then the transfer of the pelvis into the center of the part represents the idea of the biological clock. Excuse me. So at some point I got back to I felt like I had to get back to my roots of creating my own clothing. So I wanted to take away that sort of nostalgic idea that I was getting from all of the child's dresses that I was using and from the vintage clothing. So I made a collection of dresses out of sheer fabric that I titled In Her Closet. They're sheer intentionally because I think that some of the characteristics that I was representing on the dresses were things that you might not want somebody to know about you, or they were things that you kind of kept hidden close to your chest, as they say. So they look like they're wearable, they are full size, but you really can't get in and out of them because there's no zippers, or zippers that can be used for wearing. So the one on the left is Heart-Hearted, and it features a plaster and wire heart. And the one on the right is obviously very disconnected. Not everything fits together. I was able to have an exhibit of all 10 dresses in the collection at the Downtown Gallery in Kent, Ohio. And these are some pictures from the installation. On the left is on the left picture, there's a piece of one of the dresses that's titled Baggage. And around the bottom of the dress are these pockets that carry lots of different kinds of objects in them that could represent anything that somebody might carry around with them. There's some seashells that you might get at the beach. There's a few rocks. There's some sewing things, a variety of different kinds of objects. And it really made the dress very heavy. So that baggage dress is heavy. The piece across from it uses all these industrial zippers. the sort of cinch in the waist, and some of those industrial zippers are around the neck also. And that piece is called constricted. And in the picture on the right is the black and white dress is called defensive. So she kind of has her back to you, but if you walked around to the front, you would see she has her arms folded across her in a gesture that many people think of as a gesture of insecurity or protection. This particular piece is in the Interwoven exhibit. Tracy asked me to include this. It's I took some of the in her closet, excuse me, some of the in her closet pieces and photographed them inside of a closet. And then I sent them to Spoonflower, which is a print on demand company who will take artist imagery and print them on fabric. So when I got the fabric back from them, I laid it down. I used it to incorporate some paper, there's sheer fabric on there as well as other fabric. There's some lace, there's some of my zippers, some painting. And then I wanted to make this wall on the piece. It's not a quilt that has batting in it, but rather it is a piece of, it's a quilt top that's been adhered to interfacing. So there's really only just the 2 layers on there. I wanted that wall to really look like a wall. So I used joint compound to create a more textured surface. And for me, the hash marks on the wall, excuse me, represent how fast I think time flies by. Sometimes I'm keeping track of time, but a lot of times I feel like I'm missing things because time is just flying by so quickly. Another way in which my work developed was by using both sides of the work. So as quilters know, you make a quilt top, you put a batting in it, and you put a backing on it, and then you quilt all the way through. So your quilting stitches show on the front and the back as well. And so I was intrigued by that idea and wanted to see how else I could use it. So this piece is called A Page from My Ancestral Diary, and it incorporates a small piece of a vintage quilt. And then I sewed another piece on top of it. And then I used a Polaroid transfer in the middle of some clothing that's hanging in the corner of a room. And here is the back of that piece. So on the back, I had to deal with that because I wanted to show both sides. I had to deal with the rectangle that I had sewn on there. And I made 2 more Polaroid transfers of the clothing. They're on silk, to which I added some paint. And then I used the throwaway part from the Polaroid transfer. Those are the orange sections. And I added some paint to those as well. And for me, those pieces seem to represent, because they're kind of faded, they have kind of a memory quality to them. And the more vivid pieces represent perhaps the present. In 1999, when I went back to get my MFA, my first semester, I concentrated on using the sewing machine as a drawing tool. So I would use 1 piece of paper and sew through it with black thread in a free form kind of way, getting these drawings that in some ways kind of remind me of blind contour drawings, that kind of open and loose thing that you get. So this is the front and the back of one of the drawings. So the stitches go all the way through. I did add a piece of fabric to the one that's on the left, which I stained with some coffee. And you can see other coffee marks incorporated there. I did this on a number of different kinds of papers, some thick, some heavy. And so I did one on this packing cardboard that I got. And you can see I left the packing label on, which at one point in time, I would never have included something like that in my work. I wanted it to still look kind of like a package. So I used pearl cotton to kind of wrap the piece back up. One side has a dress that I tore out in the shape of the paper that I tore out in the shape of the dress, and a little bit of lace around the collar. The back has some pattern pieces that are folded up, and then I used the wax to adhere the buttons. I did a number of those also as small quilts. So this is really two different pieces. It's not the front and the back of each piece, but I wanted to show you a couple of the pieces. Part of the process of using the sewing machine as a drawing tool was also to use sewing pieces like the snaps and the safety pins in a way that they're not usually used. I wanted to use them in a non-traditional way. So I used the snaps and the safety pins as decorations or embellishments just by sewing them on, not for their useful purpose. And there's also a couple of bolts on the one on the left. The piece on the right, I had sort of a discolored piece of pillow ticking. And one side was discolored and the other side was pretty white. So this is where the material sometimes speaks to me. And I thought I could easily put slits into that pillow ticking and insert or weave the clearer pieces, the cleaner pieces through the fabric. When I was on my sabbatical, right before I went to the residency at Gentile, I took a 5-day encaustic painting class at R&F Handmade Paints in Kingston, New York. So they encouraged you to work small so that you could get a lot out of your time, your 5 days there. We worked both on paper and on wood. And so the book that you see on the bottom is an accordion fold book, which I made on 4.5 by 4.5 inches pieces of plywood. So I drew something, or I encausticed something on each piece of wood that represented somebody in my family. And if you look at the piece with the collar on it, that represents my dad, who went to work every day wearing a suit and a tie. And right above that is a picture of my dad with Aunt Anna and Aunt Dorothy, who raised him. Because I was working on wood, and wood doesn't fold the way an accordion fold books does, my friend Karen suggested that I use perhaps some leather strips at the top, which were flexible enough so that I could still get that folded kind of aspect out of the book. Here we have my Farmscape series. Nature is one of the things that I'm really interested in working with and depicting. And these pieces are 11 by 15 pieces of paper where I did one artwork each week for a year. I also like doing something that lasts over an extended period of time. So the two pieces, big pieces that you see are one piece of paper. So you're seeing the front and the back. I usually started by collaging something on, and I would collage it on. I would sew it to collage it on. I'd do a little bit of stitching, a little bit of painting, flip it over, see what that did to the back, respond to the back, similar with also by collaging and painting, and work back and forth until I felt like I had gotten to a resolution. I wasn't too far along in the series until I realized I needed some way to be able to put these things back together. And I did end up with 50 of them. So on the bottom, you can see my coding system. So for each month, I would make a box, and for each week, I decided I would draw a line. So this piece has 3 boxes on it. So this is March and one line. So it's the first week of March. Here is another piece from that series, the front and the back of that piece. It's got little brighter colors on it, so it's farther along in the series. I can't really see the stitching on that one. So if you want to exhibit two-sided work, then you really need to find a way to show both sides. So I decided to get some pieces of oak wood, and my husband routed out a groove with the table saw for me in there. And I put a piece of plexiglass, a piece of glass on each side of the work. And then I had to have some plexiglass rods made at the top, which also had groove in them to hold the sandwich together. Those rods were kind of expensive, so I only made 10 of them, and I thought I'll deal with that later if I happen to have a show. So I did get a show at Translations Gallery in Canton in 2012, right after I completed the series. And Kevin Anderson and Craig Joseph, who were running the gallery, decided to hang the pieces from the ceiling using binders, clips, and wire. And they hung them at eye level so that you could walk up and down the aisles and see both sides of the work and also see how the seasons changed. If somebody bought a piece, then Kevin, who is a master woodworker, designed a stand for it that was similar to what I had designed, only instead of the plexiglass tops, he had a piece of wood that was grooved out on the 2 sides that went halfway up and held the sandwich together. Boxes are something else that I really liked and have worked with for a long time. You remember when I first started showing the quilts, I had done box quilts in a sky. And in 1986, I made this magic boxes. It was a challenge kind of quilt where 12 of us each shared different kinds of materials. And we had to use the things that the people gave us in our work. So I gave everybody a pack of slide holders, and I received from them packages of things that I had to use. So those silver stars were something I got, the circles were something that I got. I got lots of bits and fabrics, some of the beads and things I put inside of the slide holders. So it was really fun and challenging. I was in a show that was about women's issues. And so I made this piece called Woman's Work is Never Done. I used my mom's sewing box, and I remember playing with it as a child, and I just loved that sewing box. So I traded her a brand new sewing box so I could have this one for my project. I made another accordion fold book, and out of stencil letters, which says Women's Work, it unfolded out of a tray that was in the top of the sewing box. And there's a picture of a woman, and underneath her, it says, is never done. And then in the top of the lid, I had a vintage postcard that had a woman holding scissors. I made several copies of that and stamped over and over again, never done, never done, never done. So I think we all get that. My very favorite sewing box, or my very favorite kind of box, is a box from a sewing machine drawer box. I'm really inspired by the work of Joseph Cornell and also some of the box things that Lenore Tawney did. And so, and I'm started to collect a lot of things. And so I made these 2 pieces about my great aunts. On the left is great aunt Alice, and on the right is great aunt Irene. These are from my mom's side of the family. These 2 pieces were made 20 years apart. These 2 women lived together, and in the summer, they never went anywhere without wearing their gloves and taking their pocketbooks, getting into their big old Plymouth car and driving off to go visiting. Often we would stay at their house. If I stayed overnight, we would light votive candles and say the rosary. Aunt Alice didn't really quilt, but she did a lot of sewing and needlepoint. So on top of the box, you see spools of thread and her needles. knitting needles. And she often let me iron her handkerchiefs. So that's her as a portrait inside of a handkerchief. 20 years later, unbeknownst to me that we were going to have a pandemic, I made this piece called Ordinary Saints. And it's about 3 generations of women in my family who were nurses. On the left is my great Aunt Annie. In the middle is Aunt Irene, Alice's sister. And on the right is a cousin, Eleanor. I had already made it, titled it, it was done in 2019. And it wasn't long after that when we had the shutdown and we were starting to call these kinds of people heroes. So it was just a very serendipitous thing that happened. Inside the cross that's on the photograph is the Florence Nightingale oath, which is the oath that nurses take when they graduate. Here are 2 more pieces that were made 20 years apart. Self-Portrait in a Box was made in 2002. I found this cabinet that kind of a rough made cabinet that had these blue boxes in it that when I looked at the boxes on the side of them, they all said craft, K-R-A-F-T. So they must have been cheese boxes, which somebody had repurposed into some kind of storage box. So I was now going to repurpose it into this kind of self-portrait sculpture. So I added all of the knobs and the hardware onto them. I typed some sentiments or characteristics that I thought fit me, and I put them in the box, or I put them on the outside of the box, and then I put inside the box something that represented that characteristic. So one of them says inner child, and inside of it are a bunch of toys and crayons and that kind of thing. Another one has acorns in it, and that references strength. I'm not afraid to take something that I've made and take it apart and reuse it for something else. So I had a whole lot of spoons and a whole lot of boxes. So I thought I could make something with those 2 things. And I used to tell my students, if you have enough of the same thing, you can make art because you have repetition and you have unity. So I made this Silver Spoon Secrets, and on the right is Bounty. So it's a ladle that has things that look rich or expensive. So represents the idea of having wealth and having what you need. Here is 7 of the Silver Spoon Secrets in an installation. There's now 12 of them, and they're about a variety of ideas. A couple are portraits, a couple are humorous, a couple are about social commentary. And so on the right, you see Hunger and Thirst, which is sort of the opposite of the Bounty one that you saw previously. There's a bottle inside that box, and the ladle has a stone in it. And then the tines of the fork have wire woven through them, making it kind of unusable. My final category is chairs. I love chairs. They're so like people. They have arms and legs and backs and seats. And so when I was doing my BFA show, I bought a chair, and I bought that did not have a seat on it. And I bought half of a French door. I took a lot of pictures of those 2 things. I photocopied the pictures and made collages out of them. I photographed them, and I did drawings of them. And so my project included 3 chair paintings and 3 chair quilts. So here are 2 of the painting, a chair painting and a chair quilt. And I would work back and forth on each of them, and they tended to inform each other a little bit. Then here's one that has more of the door in it. This is Attic Chairs Quilt. It was pretty dark and did really referenced for me the idea of an attic. And it was made from one of the collages that I had made using many copies of the chairs indoors. Here is Attic Chairs Painting, a lighter version of that. And it gave me the opportunity to work with the idea of light that was kind of filtering through perhaps the attic from a window. Here is Upholstery 101. It's fun to take apart something and see what's on the inside of it and use those kinds of objects or things that you find. So the burlap that you see on the outside of the chair was something that was inside the chair. The chair already had a hole in it. I exaggerated the hole a little bit. It, of course, had the upholstery tacks on it, but not this many. So I overemphasized that idea. And then this kind of chair does not have springs, but that I incorporated them at just making a hybrid kind of chair. In 2005, I did a collage a day. So that's my idea of like doing something over a long period of time. I did make one every day during that year. These are only 5 by 8 inches. I wasn't interested in really saying what was going on in the day. I was more interested in doing it as a discipline, just using whatever I found laying in my studio or perhaps an idea that I wanted to test out. So a lot of them did end up having chairs in them because of my collection of chairs and my interest in chairs. A lot of them also had dresses in them. These 2 pieces were made during the pandemic. They're both pretty large. The empty chairs is about 30 by 40, which is a large painting for me. And it references all of the anniversaries, parties, weddings, events, symphonies, all kinds of things that didn't happen during the pandemic because we were all staying isolated at home. The reading hour is a revisitation of my BFA chairs. I wanted to see where I would take that now as a person who is working with a lot of other materials. It is built on paper, but it has fabric on the substrate before I started to paint and some other collage elements. And then it has a lot of layers on it. And I really was pleased with the way this particular piece turned out. So here is my storyteller dress, which is also in the Interwoven exhibit, surrounded by a lot of mixed media pieces that I made. So I come kind of full circle, I hope, in this presentation. So I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank you all. Thank you at the Rife Gallery for inviting me to share my journey.
Yes, thank you. That was lovely. Folks, if you have any questions, go ahead and pop it into the chat and we'll get to them. So Claire, something that I like to ask a lot of artists is take us through a day in the studio with us. Can you kind of help paint the scene for us, what that feels like, looks like, smells like, tastes like?
Okay. Well, I like to work in the studio every day. That doesn't always happen, especially in the summer when gardening is like a whole nother art thing for me. But my studio is separate, so I go out there, and so it's really nice because I don't have a phone out there unless I take my phone with me, and I'm sort of just there alone. I have several different areas in the studio where I can work back and forth between different things. And often I work on 2 things at one time. If I'm working on a painting and something small, that is a good combination for me because the small thing gives me kind of a sense of accomplishment and the big thing kind of keeps going. My studio is air conditioned and it has heat in it, which is nice. So often my day in the studio in the summer is in the afternoon because it's hot and I can turn on the air. We don't have air in our house. Sometimes in the winter, my studio has to be a pop-up studio in the house because I find it extremely expensive to heat that building in the summer. But I tend to leave everything laying out. If I don't clean up a lot, there can be a lot of chaos going on in there. But I like to keep things in view because if I don't see them, I'm not going to use them.
Perfect. So we have a couple of questions for you. Shar would like to know where you see your work evolving in the future.
I really want to do a little more abstract kind of work. Um, I rely a lot on some kind of imagery in my work to help me carry a concept through. And so I would like to be able to rely more on an emotional kind of part of me to share my ideas with. So I'm working really hard on doing painting. I don't feel like the painting has to be totally non-representational, but I would like for it to have a little more loose and abstract quality to it. And I want to do, I'm mixed media, so I'm still using a lot of different kinds of materials when I work. So I hardly ever do just painting or just a collage with paper. Then I'm going to draw on it or sew on it or something. Sewing seems to be something that happens throughout all of my work.
All right. Hallelujah would like to know, what was your absolute favorite piece to work on?
Oh, they're also like children. How do you answer that question? I think I really enjoyed working on this storyteller dress that is still on the screen, because that dress, that skirt is on canvas, so it's not really on fabric, and it offered me some challenges in terms of how to really gather that canvas so that it really represented a skirt, but it also enabled me to put all the things on it that I wanted to put on it, like there's a zipper on it and all of the collage elements. And the top of that piece is from a printing press felt that had gotten damaged with some painting on it. And I was able to use that in a different way. So I'm really proud of that piece and the way that I was able to incorporate the mixed media pictures around it.
Alex would like to know if you have left any work unfinished. You just didn't feel like it was working out, or were just unmotivated to finish.
Oh, yes. I sometimes I put things aside and come back to them later, sometimes years later. I got to a point as I was getting older that I felt like I didn't need to finish everything. I found that sometimes if I totally finished something, it still wasn't any good. You know, when I was making quilts, I did that a lot. I would, oh, this doesn't work right. Well, maybe when I quilt it, it'll get fixed. And, you know, sometimes that just doesn't happen. So, but unfinished things sometimes end up being, they have good parts in them. And so they become good pieces of collage material.
Karen would like to know, what print material did you use in the accordion book Woman's Work is Never Done, 1996?
What print material?
Mm-hmm.
I think behind some of the letters, I used stencil letters, so they had the stencil part was cut out of them, and then I put some fabric behind them, and I think some of it just has paper behind it. Inside the box is sitting some binding tape, bias tape that's wrapped on some cards. I don't remember a lot of fabric in that piece.
All right. Rekha says, I know making these art pieces need a lot of effort and time. Which artwork is the hardest to work with? And also a comment on that. By the way, I find all of your artwork fascinating and beautiful.
Okay. So the question was really about which is hardest to do process. I think for me, painting is still a learning process for me. I can paint on something like I did on that skirt there, but the painting, the layering up of and of layers and being kind of free is still pretty hard for me. Sometimes the putting together of things can be kind of challenging in order to make it look, I like for the work to look finished and both up front and back sometimes as well. So those are some of the things that I find a little bit challenging. I'm not sure I answered that.
I think that's great. And we all can interpret what challenging is in different ways, and that's perfect answer. And I think that we have a comment that's kind of a perfect way to close out from Jessica, who said, Claire was one of my teachers and one of the key reasons I went into art education. Love hearing about all the awesome things she does, her thought process, techniques, and materials, and the significance of the materials. Such work from the heart. Thank you for sharing. So what a nice nod to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
All right, folks. Well, this has been an Artist Talk by Clare Murray Adams. Thank you, Claire, for your talent and time. This is a part of the exhibition slate of programming for Interwoven, the Many Voices of Fiber. Thank you to curator Tracy Rieger. I'd like to give a special thank you to all the participating artists that have made this show so special. And of course, to the governor, the legislature, and the Ohio Arts Council's board who support the OAC, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.